Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Desire Dilemma, a podcast that amplifies immigrant voices in America. I'm Funmi Apantaku-Onayemi, your host. On the previous episode of Desire Dilemma, I had a conversation with Attorney Chime Asonye, a public policy advisor and founder of Nigerian Mental Health, an initiative of more than 30 mental health organizations in Nigeria. Trained at Northwestern University in Chicago, he was a 2023 Millennium Fellow. Today, he talks about mental health interventions and his return to Nigeria to impact political conversations for better governance. You stayed in America well enough to go to college and also start your career, and then you left for Nigeria. Why?
I would say this. There was two things that helped precipitate my reason to leave. The first one is about where I can make the most impact. And sometimes it was framed in different ways, America versus Africa, or Washington, D.C. versus Chicago versus Lagos and Abuja. There was a fundamental question that has pervaded my life, which is where could I make the most impact at a particular point in time? And for the last decade that I've been essentially in Nigeria, I felt like it was on the continent. I think that I can make the most impact on the continent, whether you look at multidimensional poverty levels, whether you're looking at the challenge when it comes to civic engagement, where you look at massive reforms, where you look at the ability in terms of human capacity at different levels and tiers of governments, whether it's a subnational level and national level. So that was one area of thinking earlier in my career. And let's think about what was going on in Washington, D.C. at the time. During that time, we're having the Arab Spring. We're talking about elections today as this is the year of elections. Over half of the world is going to elections right now. We've had India. We had all these movements that's going on in Europe, whether it's France, whether it's England and things like that. We're about to have not Nigeria's election. We're about to have America's elections. This is in 2009. So this is over a decade ago. And so there's this massive civic engagement. In Nigeria, it was the year of elections. There's the birth of all these new movements, like Enough is Enough, Register and Protect Your Vote. This is when social media and using social media as a tool to monitor the elections. This is when we had a historic new chairperson in JEGA, who actually, funny enough, went to Northwestern, is a professor, and I went to Northwestern. So we had all these macro trends in terms of civic uprising that precipitated going back and being involved in Africa Rising narratives right there. We had, even the terminology has changed. We don't talk about that anymore because of the downturn in the economy post-COVID and everything like that. Now this Japa syndrome. We've literally invented language to discuss the distinction between Africa Rising and now the challenges that we see in our global economy in Africa and in Nigeria. Nigeria now has had, for the first half of this year, the Naira is the worst performing currency in the globe. So there's massive challenges now versus then, where it was where could I make the most impact and where the trends lines were going. So that was the first reason. And then the second reason is that I had an infrastructure. In Washington, D.C., I worked for 1 or 2 years. I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked in democratic governance. My theory at the time was kind of the Obama theory, which is Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions. And so I was thinking about what is the linchpin of strong global institutions, and that is Washington, D.C. and democracy being exported abroad. So I wanted to work at pillars of democratic governance. So I worked at a democratic governance organization focused on Africa. My focus countries at the time, it was called the International Republic Institute. My focus countries at the time were Uganda, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And I worked very closely with the Nigeria team, but we're doing election observations. And I really want to do election observation abroad. I want to understand what was the best practices that I can learn in terms of political party building, working with marginalized communities for individuals to help build and support the democratic institutions. And I built something at the time called Niger DC, and we had 200 plus at the, we started very small, but we ended up growing to 200 plus individuals from, and with hubs in Washington, DC, Lagos, and Abuja. And it was to help us connect with each other. First, when I was in Washington, DC, I was working in African development. There wasn't Africans in African development. It was essentially who was running and supporting programming when it comes to supporting actors domestically, especially in the democratic governance space, where didn't look like us. And so I thought that was a challenge. So I tried to create a community where we could share resources and information and knowledge. So we knew where were these events, where were these embassy, where were these conversations happening, and so we could be represented. And it just grew to 200 plus people who were high and prominent. So we had advisors to ministers in Nigeria. We had people who were chief of staffs on Capitol Hill. We had people who were, leading the development conferences at Harvard and University of Pennsylvania. We can pool those resources. We can share jobs. And the idea was, if Nigeria as a country doesn't support us, could we work together and create a countercultural community where we can support ourselves with resources, with jobs, with connections and things like that. And so because I started it and we would talk about what was going on in Nigeria and Africa, I felt like I shouldn't just be talking about it behind a desk in Washington, D.C. I should really be about it. And so that meant moving to Nigeria, putting my money where my mouth was, and really being an actor on the ground to support the difference, the change that was going on. And then because I created Nigeria DC, I already had kind of a community I fell into going on in Nigeria. And that process went for a little bit longer than I thought. So I ended up being there for many, many years. But I had created the infrastructure and I felt like I could make a change. And I created a network to help kind of create an enabling environment to make that happen.
That's quite commendable, because I know that African nations are quite sometimes difficult to penetrate that way and actually get much done. But then you left. You came back to the US.
It wasn't a viable economic proposition to continue earning Naira, to be perfectly candid, especially when you're somebody like me who grew up in America, who has phone bills, who has school bills, who has family bills, and they're all dollar denominated. So if your currency that you're making money is continuing to lessen and lessen, whereas at one point, to give people an illustration, the dollar was like $1 to 600, and now it's like, $1 to 1,200, 1,600, 1,000. That's not a sustainable lifestyle. So that was one reason I left. Second reason I left is that I wanted to put myself in a position I'm not married. And so I wanted to put myself in a position. My love and dating lifestyle there, I really had been dating long distance often in America. And probably because when I grew up in America, I was more akin, whether it's because of education and understanding. The ladies I was dating were in America. And so that long distance that I've seen kind of my parents' life is not what I wanted for my life. So if I wanted to kind of like really hone in, I need to be in America and close the gap there in terms of and distance. And then the third reason I would say is that I'm a political animal. I mean, I started my career on Capitol Hill working for a Democratic senator from New Jersey. I was involved in electoral hubs and results centers focused on what are the challenges that people who have psychosocial conditions have when accessing the electoral process. We actually have just put out a policy brief on mainstreaming mental health within the elections. I've talked to even election observers, which is kind of interesting, talking to election observers 10 years ago, being part of the organizations that did electoral observations. So things have really come full circle. And so being involved in that in Nigeria right now, also it's America's elections. We're about to have a historic election that's going to really define the face of the Supreme Court. And so I actually came here as well to get involved in the electoral process because I think this is such a defining country for the rest of the globe. And so I got involved in the campaign as a campaign manager in my home district, which is the Illinois 7th Congressional District, in terms of my base in Chicago. So those are three reasons that have brought me back. Unfortunately, my candidate lost in the primaries, but they say the battle's lost, but that doesn't mean the war is. So there's a larger war in terms of the presidency, and I will continue to do whatever is in my power to make sure that we get really good progressive people elected in power.
Yes, we do need that for sure. There was a time when Nigeria was voted one of the happiest countries in the world. While you were there, would you say you subscribe to that?
Well, if you look at the current World Happiness Index, we have gone down. So last year we were 95th. That means we're in the bottom third. This year we're 104th, which means that we've slipped even more. And so a country that is voted, and when you even think about when that happened, when they said Nigeria is one of the happiest countries in the world, this is years ago. It still kind of fits the narrative of Africa rising and us exporting things across the globe. But if you look at our community, Nigerian mental health, the conversations we're having is how can people preserve their mental health within economic downturn? That's the kind of conversations that people are having, seminars and discussions right now. If you see the approval ratings for the current administration, it's down. If you see the amount of individuals who want to travel abroad, they've increased. And just around my own social circle, everybody's leaving. It used to be the opposite way. We've been talking about the opportunities in Nigeria that want to come. When you think about basic goods, they've increased. Everybody wants to leave. Jobless syndrome is increasing. Like I said, they've invested language, and the studies are proving it. Whether it's things like COVID increasing the individuals who are upset, when you see rising rates of suicide, Nigeria has one of the seventh largest suicides on the continent and 15th largest globally. People would never expect something like that to have taken place. And so I think that is belied by the facts on the ground about what people are experiencing, how challenging the country is right now, and which is why we see an increase in some of these phenomena that we hadn't seen as much before. And that's why we see an increase in suicide rates. That's why we see an increase in mental health conditions and things like that. So unfortunately, I don't think that Nigerians are happy. And that's not just Nigerians. There's also another survey from the UNICEF, and it says that Nigerian youth feel the most pressure to succeed versus any other country in the world. So they see their parents, they see other generations that have done better, that seem to have more money, and they don't have that access. They don't have that money. They don't have those opportunities because of all these prevailing things, whether it's job insecurity, whether it's climate change, whether it's security risk, and they're nervous and they're anxious. And we need to do more to support them through these very challenging times in terms of social development and also giving them important mental health resources. It's not a fix for everything, but the fact that they don't even have nowhere to go to, where to turn to, is a challenge. And that's why Nigerian mental health started in the first place. I had gone to therapy when I was in law school, and I went to sessions, and it was very helpful me understanding who I was, trying to figure out mindful wellness practices, and work through a very challenging time in my life after the doctor recommended that I seek psychosocial support and wellness support. And when I was in Nigeria and I was looking around during also a difficult time, I didn't know where to go to. And so if I'm as connected as they come in a country, and I can't figure out where to go, then imagine someone who is in a village in the southeast or as far as in Kano. What do they do? So Nigerian Mental Health partially started as a project to help bridge that gap.
Of course, we do know that Nigeria has such huge, even though they don't talk about it, that's another problem, by the way. But we do know that we have issues of mental health. You, as a founder of Nigerian Mental Health, what do you wish to accomplish?
I want to amplify Black life. And I think you do that in one sense by creating an enabling environment for life to flourish. And so governance architecture is a big part of that conversation. And people do not understand that we are still dealing with the remnants of colonialism in Nigeria. Nigeria's governance architecture started off as a British colonial ordinance around 1918 and was codified as something called the Lunacy Act in 1956, 1958. And so we had a colonial governance architecture that even the British people in the UK repealed some of these laws, but they did it right after, especially with criminalizing of things like suicide. They did it right after Nigeria became independent. And so, those things weren't cascade. But if you see countries right now across the globe where things like suicide is criminalized, all of them are either products of former colonial administrations of that imperial order. So one thing is I want is to help break that colonial order and have improved a robust human rights infused mental health architecture where all mental health actors can succeed. And because I'm a lawyer, I naturally gravitate to things like public policy, law, and strategy. Nigerian Mental Health helped lead national stakeholder advocacy to help get the new Mental Health Act passed at the end of 2022. We're proud of that accomplishment. We have been involved with drafting a new suicide prevention framework for the country. We're one of less than 10 countries that have a suicide prevention framework. We helped draft a new revised mental health policy after the old one had a decade of dormancy, and we're concentrating on things like monitoring and evaluation, which is the reason why these policies have failed in the past. And now we're doing some global work on that with Yale and with Northwestern Center for Racism and Disability Justice, because there's other countries that like Nigeria that are nascent or are doing major mental health reforms, and they need guidance in terms of best practices, monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and understanding of cultural best practices that they can infuse or things that they should elevate within their work. The second thing is around the research piece. I think is very important because of things like debate. Evidence is very important, and evidence-based interventions are very important. We can't have these ad hoc because these are people's lives at stake. So what are the best interventions? What is the research saying? Making sure we do that. And so I would say research and evidence, but research doesn't just have to be evidence-based. It's to also be based on lived experience. The disability, a common mantra in the disability justice movement is nothing for us without us. And so how do you incorporate lived experience? How do you incorporate evidence-based best practices? How do you incorporate multi-stakeholder perspectives? Because a lot of times there's a hegemony on a certain discipline, especially within mental health. And we need to have cross-sectoral advocacy. So that means it's not just psychiatrists or psychologists, but also the lay counselors or the pharmacists or the psychiatric nurses or the medical social workers, right? How do you incorporate that multi-stakeholder, that knowledge so you get the best possible outcome? And the third, and I think the most important reason, which is really hard to quantify, is about just connection. It takes spiritual labor in order for us to have the resilience to continue this very fragile, vulnerable, precarious work when it comes to mental health. It's hard. There's not a lot of funding for it. There's a lot of competition. It's not really understood. It's really hard to quantify what the good is. I was having conversations at the global level, and they're thinking about financing and what would appropriate mental health financing look like. And one of the conversations was, what does good look like? It's not like other fields where it's very easy to understand and articulate what the good looks like when you have things like mental health, where you have relapse, where it's hard to measure and assess, where it's hard to figure out how these things impact specific business outcomes, even though we know what they do. So how does even the good? So we need the connection for the actors in the field to feel like they are supported, feel like they can lean on each other, they can share resources with each other, they know who each other's are, they can galvanize, we can resolve things like mistrust, we can build community, and that gives us the spiritual energy to continue to fight. So that third is probably the most important. Is how Nigerian mental health started, which wasn't based on lofty outcomes of transforming the mental health impact or like trying to get this law passed. It really just started about trying to connect with each other and giving us the spiritual energy to continue to engage in this important work. And I always like to emphasize this because a development partner, they look, how many lives saved or how many, crisis hotlines started. It's hard to talk about what connection means, right? But when it comes to BIPOC, Black, immigrant, Nigerian, Pan-African, diaspora, whatever communities, we cannot separate this connection. We need to talk about resilience. We need to talk about our psychological fortitude. They may not understand, and it might not be an outcome for them or these institutions, but it is for us to continue to sustain and live and breathe and survive. And so that connection piece is so valuable, but it's often hard to articulate for individuals who are not involved or connected to these communities.
Thank you so much for that. From your answer, I believe that you're thinking Nigeria, you're also thinking America. And as for immigrants, is almost vital. And I do know, and I'm sure you're aware, that a lot of conversations have been heard in terms of mental health issues. People are now talking about it. People are now really getting funding for it. So when or if you should start or replicate what you have with the Nigerian mental health in the United States, would you be looking at the possibility of actually looking for the funding that will support the immigrant base, including Nigerian, of course, and also looking for international funding as well for Nigerian-based work that you do?
Yeah, of course. We're certainly looking for partners and figuring out what makes sense. We have over 40 plus organizations, but some of the organizations that we work with are in America, are in Europe. We have at least 3 Nigerian-focused organizations that are based in America that are part of the Nigerian Mental Health Network. And so I recently, with some Nigerian organizations, actually just had an advocacy visit to meet Chicago's Commissioner on Public Health. And we talked about challenges in the public health. We talked about health equity. We talked about these things as it relates to immigrant communities. And there was really interesting findings. A lot of people don't know that Mayor Johnson, which is the executive head, the mayor of this city, is making huge changes in terms of mental health reforms. And so for the better or for the worse, regardless, we need to understand why and how it impacts us and what we can do to share our concerns. And so we are looking, and that's one of the reasons why we are looking for how to expand the work here. That's one of the reasons why we have this recent conversation about I like the way you framed it, thinking about Nigeria, we're all also acting internationally and in America. That's one of the reasons why we can collaborate with Yale and Northwestern, because we want to figure out how some of the learnings that we've had, some of the best practices, some of the insights on Nigeria can inform global best practices in general. And so we're very much about expanding this conversation and see how we can connect. And we're exploring different methods. We're connecting with domestic Nigerian organizations. We're having conversations with the psychiatrists, psychologists, et cetera, that exist in America. And we're trying to see what the opportunities are.
So just before we finish this, I just want to ask you two very quick questions. We've established that you're a political worker at this time. Are you looking to become a full-fledged politician?
I don't like to say politician, but I like to say public servant. I believe that the public institutions and institutions of government have a sacred responsibility to the people. We need actors within government. We can't cede the government to individuals that don't have our interests at heart, because we pay taxes to them. We support them. They have a profound impact on how we live our everyday lives. And so we need individuals and actors that can be a bridge to the communities that are important or are vulnerable or are displaced or are differently abled. And so because of my legal experience, my experience working on both sides of the world, my experience within government at all levels of government, because of the unshakable belief that I have in education, that gave me the exposure not only of Chicago, but to understand what was going on in foreign affairs and international best practices and how they inform what we're doing at a local and global arena. I want to use those language and tools and partnerships and research and advocacy to continue to be a bridge. And so I don't know about politician, but I certainly will be a public service, and however that manifests, whether it is as an elected position or if it is in the private sector or it is in diplomatic community, I'm open to anything that's on the horizon.
And finally, you wrote somewhere that you pursue politics with an artist's heart. What do you mean by that?
I think connection is so important. And I think that is what something like art can do in terms of the empathy, the vulnerability to the cultural expression, the ability to humanize things. And I think that is what I would like to see in the political. I would like to see in our servant leaders. I would like to see in our business representatives or our public officials. I would like to see people who are vulnerable, who are empathetic, who can draw connection. And I would like to see that privilege. I think that when you draw those connections and you share what happens during your weakness time, you're able to really understand and bring those perspectives to the fore. I think one of the reasons why the face of suicide around the world is an African male is because our governance, what we value, is antithetical to vulnerability or displaying weakness or trying to connect. It's all about, I'm a strong man and let me solve your problems through money or through force. I think we would value more if we think about it, reimagine what leadership could look like or what strength could look like if we embody things like empathy and vulnerability and connection. And so to the extent I see actors and models out there that do that, anything from Gandhi to Martin Luther King, those are some of my role models to see how I can imbibe those ethoses, because not only do I think that makes us better leaders, but I also think that helps kind of deconstruct what strength and masculinity should be and what it looks like.
Thank you so much for your time, and I really have learned quite a lot from you. Thank you for your transparency, and thank you for your work as a public servant. I just wish you the best in this work because I know it's not an easy one. I pray that you'll accomplish your goals when it comes to mental health, not just in Nigeria and not just in the United States, but all over the world. Thank you again for your time, and thank you for coming. This is the last episode of Season 2. We thank you for your support, your comments, your subscriptions, and encouragement. Desire Dilemma will return soon with Season 3. We look forward to your continued support. We want you to share our podcast. We also want you to call us or go on our website, desiredilemma.com, for more episodes. Thank you so much for being with us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.